call Chris Farfoy.
Mr. Speaker, to Mr. Ross, maybe it's the supermoon. Maybe it's the supermoon that has changed our opinions of the government so much that we think we should support this piece of legislation. But it is true that this is one of those rare occasions where the moon is shining bright and a number of other parties other than ACT and National support a piece of National Party legislation. So we can be forsaken for our balance maybe being a bit thrown off by the unusual tides of the supermoon and for the fact that we are supporting this piece of legislation. Just at risk of an interjection by the Honourable Simon Bridges before about myself having a record, I'd just like to clarify for the House I've only been in court once for my inability to pay a fine for not having a lights on my bicycle in the early 90s. So just to clarify for that, for Mr Bridges, I have been to court once, but I got away without having to pay that fine because I was only 16 or 17 years of age. But Mr Speaker, Labor does support this bill. It is a relatively technical bill and it is amending three bills, as has been mentioned before, both the Bail Act, the Sentencing Act and the Parole Act, 50-ish amendments in total. And as the Honourable Phil Goff mentioned earlier in the debate, it is making these amendments to ensure that we can do away with some barriers and ensure there is more effective management of community sentences and orders. As it stands now, the three acts that cover this area are either silent or unclear on a number of areas around community sentences or home detention orders, and we need to do away with the farcical situation that Phil Goff mentioned before, that if someone is on home detention, scarpers, that time that they're missing in action still counts towards their sentence. So for those technical reasons, Mr Speaker, we are supporting this bill. Labor does support a correction system that secures the public safety, and of course there are only certain types of offenders that can be eligible for community non-prison sentence. And we support that, and also we support ensuring the rehabilitation of offenders. And as Mr Goff mentioned in his earlier contribution, there is a much better rate of non-recidivism for those who have home detention sentences and community sentences and orders than those who have short prison terms. Mr Speaker, the barriers that are in the current legislation really impinge on corrections staff, and hopefully this will help corrections staff and the judiciary to better effectively deal with offenders who are given non-custodial sentences. And there has been a huge increase in the use of non-custodial sentences. I understand it's slowing down as of late, but in 2006 to the year to June, I understand that there were 33,965 non-custodial community sentences handed down, and in the year to June 2011 that had increased to 63,168, a doubling of those sentencing options around non-custodial community sentences. And home detention also received a similar increase. In the year to June 2006, 1,293 home detention sentences were handed out, but in the year to June 2011, over 3,700 home detention sentences had been handed out. So this is an important piece of legislation in terms of the context of the increasing use of the non-custodial sentence, and hopefully the changes that within this bill will ensure that in terms of how we deal with these offenders, we can be much more efficient and effective. There is a relatively good fiscal argument as to why we should be looking to non-custodial sentences for offenders who are low risk. At the moment, a taxpayer pays around about $58 per day to keep someone in home detention, and that is roughly a quarter of what it costs to keep someone imprisoned, with the cost of which is $249 per day. So it is fiscally responsible to examining widening the use of home detention rather than dismissing it because some see it as not being tough on crime, and certain people who are out there in the community who say we should be locking people up more and more often should take note of the fiscal argument as to why we should not be locking more people up. Mr. Speaker, we also need to ask our question as to why we convict and sentence people. We do it to punish them if they've transgressed against the law. We take away their freedom, and we think that is a relatively serious punishment. And while they are either in prison or they are serving a home detention or a parole or another order, we ask them to ponder their actions and to see the error of their ways, and hopefully that they can think in the future they might modify their behaviour. And we also should be dealing with any issues that they may have, whether they be within their family, whether they be mental health issues or behavioural issues. But I think most Kiwis would agree that when people transgress, they should be punished, and whether that be a custodial or non-custodial sentence. We also want to make sure that these people don't re-offend. And recidivism is something that this government has said, and Judith Collins said, that we have put a lot more emphasis on rehabilitation. But, Mr. Speaker, in that respect, the reality doesn't necessarily match up, the rhetoric doesn't, match up with the reality. Mr. Goff mentioned earlier on about the great success of home detention sentences around recidivism. Between 2007 and 2008, those who got home detention sentences who were reconvicted in the next 12 months was at 21.5%. For the next year it was 23%. But for those who were in relatively similar short-term prison sentences in the same years, the reconviction rate was 50.3% and 52.6% in 2008 and 2009. So it shows you there that the use of home detention orders and community sentences is much more effective in terms of reducing the rates of recidivism for those who are subject to those sentences. Mr. Speaker, and in terms of the rhetoric not meeting the reality, that was also picked up by the Salvation Army in their State of the Nation report earlier this year. It said in their report around recidivism, as in previous years, the rates of reoffending and re-imprisonment have remained disappointingly consistent, with the reported outcomes of 2010-11 showing no discernible trend of improvement or deterioration from previous years. This constancy is shown in the data provided. It goes on to say that spending on prisoner rehabilitation only rose marginally, around 1.1% increase, taking inflation into account. And so, Mr. Speaker, in terms of what Judith Collins said around putting a lot more emphasis on rehabilitation, we haven't seen it at that end. We think this government should take more action in terms of using home detention. It has, as I pointed out in those statistics, had a lot better result in terms of recidivism. So, Mr. Speaker, we will support this bill because it does make some very good changes to those three acts that I mentioned before, but we do believe that this may be another attempt by the government to look tough on law and order. I also look forward to looking at this bill at the Law and Order Select Committee. I'm sure it will get a thorough looking at, and I encourage people to make submissions to that Law and Order Select Committee so we can look at some of the real issues that we are dealing with around recidivism in terms of those who serve non-custodial and custodial sentences. So we support this bill.
Mark Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, it's with great pleasure that I take a call on this. The administration